Well, I'm pretty confident that I'm not going to be able to explain or even talk about everything this passage is speaking about. And so, if your expectations are that I will, you will be disappointed. Talking about freedom, talking about being in slavery, talking about walking in the spirit, talking about how that is different than the flesh. There's a lot of things that need a little bit of defining if we can make at least some sense, some headway in trying to think about what Paul is saying. So I want to start with freedom. There's a very powerful opening to our reading, verse 1. It is for freedom that we have been set free. I mean, Christ sets us free for the purpose of freedom. It begs the question, well, what is that freedom? What does that mean? And he says, don't be a, do not return to be subject again to a yoke of slavery. Well, what was and is the slavery? We often think of freedom as being completely unfettered, no restraints. I can do whatever I want. That is not the freedom that Paul is talking about. That's a kind of libertarian freedom, where I have no restraints on me at all. I can do whatever I want. If you notice down in verse 17, when he's talking about it, when he's talking about what's going on, he says, for the flesh sets its desire against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. For there are in for these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. I think somewhat ironically, the slavery that he's talking about was a slavery to doing what you want, which sounds like freedom until you realize that what you want to do when it's unenlightened, when it's uninformed, when it's unredeemed, it's what brings you all your troubles, right? It's what Paul's talking about is living in the flesh, living according to your own desires, your own appetites, your own ideas. I just want to do this. How does that work out? You know, that's a kind of slavery, although at first it doesn't seem like it. And so, what I think Paul's talking about, if I'm trying to look at it in a broad way, is we've been set free. And one of the things we've been set free from, really the main ideas he has, is we've been set free from a life of the flesh, that we might have the freedom of the life of the spirit. And he goes on in this passage to talk about, well, what are the works of the flesh? Doesn't sound really great. I mean, it kind of does a little bit. Well, the carousing sounds like fun, but it goes, dissension and hatred, and it just goes through this list, and it's like none of that ends well. And yet, the fruit of the spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, these are good things. And so, in an overall way, we've been set free from a life of the flesh for a freedom of the life of the spirit. Now, sometimes when we're reading this passage, we think, or you've heard people talk about, we've been set free from the law, and there is a part of that that is true. Let me explain. I mean, I've already given away the idea with the title "Free to Love." Really, we've been set free to love. And there is a sense in the part that our reading skipped over, verses 2 down through 12, he does talk about the practice of circumcision, which was part of the law. And you could easily think, well, we've been set free from the law. We no longer need the law. But notice what he says as our reading begins. When he starts with, we've been set free, then verse 13, don't let your freedom become an opportunity for the flesh, because that's really the bondage. Go back to that. We don't want to go back to that. But then he says in verse 14, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. See, Paul's not really arguing the law was our slavery and we've been set free from that. He's arguing, no, our sinfulness has been our slavery. And the law, which was always talking about love your neighbor anyway, it was talking about love. Somehow in our fleshliness, we made the law into this burdensome thing that wasn't really even about love. We misconstrued the law. And so, yes, we've been set free from the law in the sense of a poor reading of it. that made it burdensome and legalistic and missed the whole point of it was telling us, hey, go love one another. So, what Paul, as I see it, is saying is we've been set free. Free from what? Our kind of sinfulness that really consumed us. And that seemed like freedom. I could do whatever I want, but none of that really made for a rich and full life. And it led to all the heartache and problems. So I've been set free from my sinfulness, i.e., my flesh. And in being set free from that, no longer read the law as some sort of burdensome legalistic code, but I understand what it was always say: love your neighbor as yourself. And now, in the freedom of the Spirit, we can love. We can practice the very things that God has always been communicating to us, even when we read his scriptures poorly and made it burdensome. So I think that's a general sense of what Paul is talking about. The new kind of freedom, the real freedom, is the capacity to do the will of God. I mean, I really do believe it's a true statement that apart from God's help, I am not really able to do the will of God. Even if I would want to, I would fail. I need assistance. I need God's aid. I need to say, God, help me to do the very things that even if I had a desire to do, I would mess them up. Even if I want to love my neighbor well, without God's help, I won't be able to do that. Not as effectively or as truly as I need. Which is why Paul talks about a life in the Spirit and walking in the Spirit. What does Paul understand? Well, we this morning's readings, the reading from John chapter 14, Jesus promising the Spirit, promising a kind of intimate life with the Father, Son, and Spirit, empowered, enabled in ways to do what we would not otherwise be able to do. The very presence of God moving in our lives as comforter, as helper, as the one who brings us the love of God, the peace of God. See, it's that understanding that I need God's help to be able to live out a kind of extraordinary life, extraordinary in the sense that it's out of the ordinary, one that truly is a life of love. And we must turn to the Spirit. So Paul's talking about, well, let's walk in the Spirit. Notice in verse 16, but I say, walk in the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. My own tendencies. And I know, let me clarify something else. Sometimes it was poorly done in the uh, NIV translation when it first came out. They decided to translate the word flesh as sinful nature. Well, that wasn't a good idea. It wasn't completely wrong. There is a sense in which there is a kind of pervasive sinfulness in us. We certainly have that. But when Paul says flesh, he's not talking about the nature in which we were created. If we say, well, we have a sinful nature, it sounds like saying, well, God made me this way. And I don't believe that God made us sinful. How did God make us? Well, he made us weak. We're not strong and powerful. We're made to be, well, ignorant. We have to learn and grow. We're frail. I mean, these are all aspects of the human condition that we all acknowledge. We're weak. We're prone to make mistakes. We don't know everything, which is most of the time why we screw up. We do things wrong because we didn't understand. We've been made that way. It's not sinful, but it is certainly open and prone to a kind of making mistakes. So when Paul's talking about the flesh, he's saying we have a propensity to mess things up. And it's out of ignorance and weakness and all sorts of frailties. And what Paul is saying is walk by the Spirit and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. You will not act on the kind of weaknesses that seem to be common to all of us, that are common to all of us, and we know it. And if don't have the Spirit of God, the help of God, I'm going to just all the time keep stumbling and falling and making mistakes and doing things to hurt others and myself. But what Paul says, if we cultivate this life of walking in the Spirit, depending on the Spirit, that God will help us to live above and beyond our kind of human tendencies. In one sense, natural because they're common, not natural because we were made to be sinful, but natural in the sense that, well, it's what I easily fall into. It's a kind of acquired nature that we humans were not given by God, but we have certainly um, acquired for ourselves through our habits and through our tendencies. He goes on to say in 17, for the flesh sets its desires against the spirit. I mean, what I want in my kind of unredeemed self, well, I often want things that benefit me more than my neighbor. I want me to be first. And that comes easily to me, and in some sense, naturally to me, right? Not because God gave me that nature, but it just makes obvious sense to me. Why shouldn't I be first? And so I easily think that way. Paul says, for the flesh sets its desire against the spirit. It's not wanting the things of the Spirit of God, and the spirit against the flesh. There's two different agendas, two different sets of desires. For these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. And so there's this struggle between doing what I want, the so-called freedom of I just want to do what I want, and the better path that I come to recognize that what I want to do is often not the best. But may I learn to do the works of God. May I learn to love, forgive, have mercy, compassion, do all of these things that are of God and that in fact will enhance my own experience of life. So he goes on in 18, but if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now here he brings in that idea. Now it's no longer this kind of need to follow the rules. The Spirit's leading us into the very love that the law talked about. Love your neighbor. And maybe those laws could help you get started like training wheels on a bicycle. But when you're living in the Spirit, when you're walking by the Spirit, you take off the training wheels and you no longer need just kind of an edict, a command that says, do this. You've taken it to heart through the Spirit. And now you're able to sense and intuit what it is, moment by moment, to live more of a life of love. So I don't need to have a list of instructions. I've gotten caught up in this love of God through the Spirit. And now this is becoming what is natural, much more in the Spirit. How do we do this? Well, that's the practical question, isn't it? How do you walk in the Spirit? Um, oh, I wish there were 3 bullet point answers to that. Point 1, point 2, point. But if I gave that, hopefully you would say, I think he's oversimplified it. I hope you would have the wisdom to say, I don't think he did that justice. I mean, we have the whole example of Jesus. We have the testimony of the Gospels. We have the writings of Paul. We have all these letters. We have the history of Christian tradition, of spirituality. All of that is trying to tell us this is how we walk in the Spirit. And I can't boil that down to something overly simplistic. It would not do the subject justice, and nor would it give you good guidance. But maybe we can say it certainly involves a kind of openness to the movement of God, a recognition that God is in fact moving, alive, present, energizing, powerful in each moment and within us. And somehow, which is what all the talk about spirituality is really discussing, when I can connect to that and be much more in tune with that movement of God, then I am walking in the Spirit. Are there things to do? Oh, yes. We can talk about prayer. We can talk about various spiritual disciplines. We can talk about the um, the kind of harnessing of our thoughts so that they just don't run everywhere and think about the things that are not good for us. We can talk about all of those, and those are all helpful practices. But in general, it's this idea of I need to find out how to be connected to God. That's not because God is somehow far away and distant. God is closer to me than I am to myself. The Spirit absolutely penetrates every aspect of our lives. But we have to learn how to wake up and be aware of that presence. Hear that voice, sense that guidance. Not easy. You spend a lifetime doing it. We've been spending our lives trying to do this. And I think if we look back, we can probably say, I've seen progress. I think I recognize things now that I didn't before. Perhaps I'm more aware in ways that I wasn't. Notice how Paul ends. If we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit. He says to these Christians, if you understand, and they did, that the way that they lived was by the Spirit of God, that he says, if you accept that to be a fundamental truth about your life in Christ, you live by the Spirit. The Spirit brings you the life of Christ. He says then, so let us walk by that Spirit. Now there's the invitation to the very messy, constant work of saying, how do I then make a kind of contact and experience the fellowship and the unity of the possibility of having this Spirit alive in me? We are alive in the Spirit, no doubt about it. Then comes the hard part. How then do I walk in the very life that I have? Because somewhat ironically, I'm often not alive to my own life, right? There's a life within me, fully radiant with the glory and possibility of God's own presence, and I am still living some other path, not connected to the very life that's there. And so we open ourselves, we invite the Spirit, and we practice day by day what it means to live in that Spirit.
Amen.